The year was 1553, and England was a kingdom soaked in fear. The shadow of Henry VIII still loomed over every stone of Whitehall, every whisper in the court. His 6 marriages had torn the country apart, leaving behind broken families, shattered alliances, and a nation at war with itself over God. When Henry died, he left not stability, but a legacy of paranoia. England was divided, Protestant reformers demanding change, Catholic loyalists clinging to the old faith, and a populace exhausted by decades of bloodshed. Every sermon, every royal decree carried the weight of life and death. A wrong prayer could mean the stake. A wrong friend could mean the scaffold. And in the midst of this storm stood Mary Tudor, the daughter of a king who had declared her a bastard and a mother who had died broken and exiled. To the English people, Mary was both a symbol and a scar, the rightful heir, yes, but also the living reminder of Henry's sins. Her claim to the throne was not just a political act, it was a war cry. When her half-brother Edward VI died, the Protestant coup attempted to crown Lady Jane Grey. Mary's supporters rose in rebellion, blood-stained the streets before she ever wore the crown. But England did not see a savior ascend the throne. They saw a woman molded by loss and humiliation, stepping into power with a heart that had been ground into steel. A woman who had been forced to choose between her soul and her survival. Mary's coronation was not a celebration, it was a reckoning. The bells rang not with joy, but with the sound of chains being locked into place. And in the chill of that autumn morning, as the crown touched her head, Mary Tudor swore something that would define her reign. If her father's sins had torn England apart, she would burn them out one soul at a time. Before Mary became a queen. She was a child who learned that love could be taken away at the stroke of a quill. She was Henry VIII's beloved daughter once, the Pearl of England. But when Henry's obsession with Anne Boleyn shattered his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Mary's world collapsed. At 17, she was stripped of her title, declared illegitimate, and forced to serve her infant half-sister, Elizabeth, as a lady-in-waiting. To survive, she was told to sign papers renouncing her mother and acknowledging her father as head of a new church. For months, she refused. That refusal nearly killed her. Isolated, humiliated, and constantly watched, Mary broke under the weight of her father's wrath. When she finally signed the papers, she was not the same girl. Something inside her hardened a scar you could not see, but would one day set a nation ablaze. Her mother's death soon followed, alone and abandoned in exile. Mary wore black for months, not just in mourning, but as a quiet declaration of war. That grief burned into her bones, mingling with the shame of her bastard status. Every prayer, every mass she heard in secret became a promise. Her mother's faith would not die. When Edward VI took the throne years later and Protestantism was forced into law, Mary became a ghost in her own country. Spies followed her priests, were hunted, and she lived knowing that at any moment she could be arrested or killed for the old faith. But suffering has a way of shaping power, and Mary's suffering carved her into something England had never seen before. A woman who believed her throne was not merely a right, but a divine weapon. By the time Edward lay dying and the Protestant council tried to crown Lady Jane Grey, Mary was no longer the broken girl who signed away her soul. She was the woman who would take back everything that had been stolen. even if the price was blood. Asterisk, July 1553. The country was a powder keg. Edward VI was dead, and with his last breath, the Protestant council crowned Lady Jane Grey. Mary Tudor, the rightful heir, was declared a traitor. But Mary did not run. She did not hide. She rode through the back roads of East Anglia. She summoned her supporters. Peasants, soldiers, and Catholic nobles answered her call not out of love, but out of desperation. To them, Mary was not a queen yet. She was a symbol, the old faith in flesh and blood, a chance to undo years of reform with fire and steel. The rebellion was swift and bloody. Jane's reign lasted only 9 days. The council betrayed her as soon as Mary's army swelled to thousands. London opened its gates to the daughter of Henry VIII, not with cheers, but with the wary silence of a people who had seen too many crowns change hands under the shadow of the axe. On the morning of her coronation, Mary knelt before the altar of Westminster Abbey. Witnesses swore they saw tears on her face as she whispered a prayer to her mother. But those tears were not of joy. They were of vengeance. The ghosts of Catherine of Aragon and thousands of dead Catholics seemed to gather behind her, urging her to cleanse England of its sins. Yet even in triumph there was betrayal. Mary's counselors pressed her to marry quickly, fearing her throne would crumble without a male heir. That urgency would lead her into the arms of Philip of Spain, a union that would spark rebellion, hatred, and doom. As the crown touched her head, England did not gain a queen. It gained a storm forged in exile, sharpened by humiliation, and fueled by a promise made long ago beside a dying mother. If Mary ever had power, she would use it to bring God back to England, no matter how much blood it cost. The first act of Mary's reign was not a law or a proclamation. It was a mass. Within days of taking the throne, the sound of Latin prayers echoed once more through the chapels of Whitehall. Priests who had hidden in fear stepped into the light. Altars stripped bare under Edward VI were restored, candles flickering in the dark like defiant stars. To Mary, this was not politics. It was salvation. But salvation, in her hands, came with a blade. Parliament repealed Protestant reforms. England was once more bound to Rome. Those who resisted were not just rebels, they were heretics, enemies of both crown and God. And Mary had spent too many years as a hunted woman to show mercy now. Her marriage to Philip of Spain poured oil on the fire. England saw it as betrayer, foreign king's shadow over their land. Rebellions erupted. The Wyatt Rebellion of 1554 nearly reached London itself. Mary stood before the armed rebels, her voice trembling but unyielding. "I am the true wife to my realm and my people." The uprising was crushed. That rebellion hardened her heart. Mercy had nearly cost her crown. So when the first Protestant leaders were dragged to the stake, Mary did not flinch to her. This was not cruelty, it was penance. England had wandered into sin, and she believed the only way to cleanse it was through fire. Yet in the smoke rising from Smithfield, something else began to burn: Mary's humanity. Each execution was a prayer, a plea to God to save her soul and her kingdom. But every scream, every charred body left a mark. The queen who once knew suffering now became the architect of it. And as the fires rose higher, so too did the whispers of a name that would follow her into death: Bloody Mary. Smithfield Market, London. A place once filled with the noise of merchants and livestock became a stage for fear. The first of the condemned were brought in chains, their faces pale against the rising pyres. When the fire took them, it was not quick. Witnesses spoke of the smell, first the sharp, sickening stench of burning flesh carried through the market, skin blistered and split, blood hissing as it met the flames. Some screamed prayers until their lungs turned to ash. Others were silent, their eyes fixed on the crowd, as if asking whether anyone would dare to save them. And the crowd came. Thousands, men, women, even children. Some wept, some jeered, but most just watched. It was not just Smithfield. Fires rose in Oxford, Canterbury, Gloucester. The names of the condemned filled the air like a litany. Ridley, Latimer, Cranmer, architects of Protestant reform, now reduced to bone and smoke. To Mary, these were victories. Each execution, she believed, was a soul ripped from the jaws of hell. But even those closest to her began to see the toll. The Queen would weep after Mass, her hands trembling as if she felt the heat herself. Yet she did not stop, could not, because beneath the faith was fear. Mary knew rebellion still brewed. She knew the people whispered against her, and she believed, perhaps more than anything, that her reign depended on fire keeping them silent. But fire does not silence. It spreads. By 1555, the smell of charred flesh had become England's unholy incense. Mothers held their children closer when they saw the stakes being built. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and in the smoke, the Queen's name twisted into something more than human. Bloody Mary. A curse whispered into the air, as if the fires themselves had spoken it. By 1556, the fires had burned more than England's heretics. They had burned Mary herself. The Queen, who once walked among her people, now hid behind palace walls. Every corridor felt colder, every shadow whispered. She began to dream of flames not as salvation, but as judgment. In the dark, she heard the voices of those who had died screaming her name. Her marriage to Philip, meant to secure her throne, only deepened her loneliness. He was a king in title, but absent in flesh, leaving Mary with empty chambers and a court that whispered of her failures. And then came the cruelest twist of all: the swelling of her belly, the hope of an heir, the belief that God had blessed her womb. It was not a child, it was a ghost, a phantom pregnancy that left her broken in body and spirit, her people mocking her behind closed doors. The burnings continued, but something shifted. Where once Mary had seen righteousness, now she saw only necessity. The fires were no longer prayers. They were chains, holding together a throne built on fear. Her counselors watched a queen unravel. She would sit for hours in silence, clutching a rosary until her fingers bled. She would order executions with a voice that sounded hollow, as if the words came from somewhere outside herself. And yet she could not stop. Every burning was another desperate plea to a God she feared had turned his face away. By the time the last pyres were lit, Mary Tudor was no longer a monarch of flesh and blood. She was a figure made of smoke and whispers, a queen consumed by the very fires she had set. England watched and waited, because no fire, no throne, no prayer could stop the decay that had already begun, not just in the kingdom, but in the Queen's own body. It began with a pain she couldn't name, a tightness in her stomach, a heaviness in her limbs. At first, Mary thought it was grief or exhaustion. Then came the swelling. Again, she believed it was a child. A second chance after the phantom pregnancy that had humiliated her. Her prayers were frantic, bargaining with a God she feared she had angered. Let this be real. Let this be my redemption. But weeks turned into months, and no child stirred within her. Instead came the fevers, the weakness, and something else, something her ladies would later whisper about. With pale faces, her skin began to change. At first, a grayish hue, then darker. Patches of black spreading like ink beneath her flesh. The smell followed soon after. Not the sweet perfume of the queen's chambers, but the sour, unmistakable stench of rot. Physicians called it dropsy. Others murmured cancer. But in the corridors of St. James's, a different word crept like poison. Curse Mary's body. Once the vessel of England's salvation was betraying her in the most grotesque way imaginable. She tried to hide it layers of clothing, heavy veils, but the stench clung to her like a shadow. Courtiers would bow and then leave, gagging into their sleeves. The council grew restless. Philip stayed away, his letters cold and distant. Her enemies whispered that God himself had struck her down for the fires, for the blood. Alone in her chambers, Mary prayed harder than ever. But the prayers felt hollow, as if they never reached beyond the rotting shell of her body. And perhaps the cruelest part of all, she still hoped, still placed her hand on her swollen stomach and begged for the child she knew would never come. Her reign had been built on fire, but now the fire was gone. All that remained was the slow, creeping darkness spreading through her veins. By autumn of 1558, the sickness was no longer a secret. Servants spoke of it in hushed voices, priests in fearful prayers. The queen's flesh had begun to betray her completely. Black spots bloomed across her skin, spreading up her legs, her abdomen even, her face. Her one-spell hands now looked charred, as if the fire she had unleashed on England had turned inward, burning her from within. And then there was the smell. No herbs, no incense, no perfume could mask it. It was the smell of death, a heavy, cloying stench that clung to the corridors of St. James's Palace. Courtiers held handkerchiefs to their faces. Visitors left, pale and shaken. Some refused to enter her chambers at all. For the people outside the palace walls, the story twisted into legend. They said her body was rotting alive, that her womb, once meant to bear an heir, had turned black and filled with fluid, that the screams of the burned had cursed her flesh. Mary herself began to believe it. In her fevered prayers, she begged forgiveness not for her sins, but for the lives she had taken in God's name. She thought of Ridley, Latimer, Cranmer, their faces flickering in the firelight, as if they stood beside her bed. Alone she would weep and clutch at her stomach, whispering to the child who never was. Philip did not come. He sent letters full of duty, but empty of love. In them, Mary saw her failure reflected back. No heir, no redemption, only a decaying body and a kingdom already slipping from her grasp. Her counselors stopped speaking of the future. They spoke only in murmurs about what would come after Mary. Tudor, the first queen of England, the woman who had set her nation ablaze in faith, now lay in her bed, her body collapsing into blackened ruin. And outside her chamber door, the court held its breath, not in mourning, but in anticipation of her last dot. The morning of November 17, 1558, broke grey and cold over London. Inside St. James's Palace, the air was heavy with incense, as if the priests could smother the stench of death with prayer. Mary Tudor lay beneath heavy velvet blankets, her once commanding figure reduced to a frail shadow. Her skin was waxy, streaked with blackened patches. Her lips moved in whispers no one could hear. Those who stood closest said her eyes wandered the room as if following something no one else could see. Perhaps it was her mother. Perhaps the faces of the burned, waiting in the haze between life and death. She clutched a crucifix to her chest as if holding on to God himself, but the silence in the chamber was deafening. For all her prayers, no miracle came. Her last words were soft, almost a confession. When I am dead, they will have the joy of their hearts. And then, silence. The first reigning Queen of England was gone. There was no mourning in the palace corridors, only movement. Advisors slipped away to prepare the transfer of power. Courtiers whispered the name they had all been waiting for. Elizabeth. Mary's body, already blackened in life, darkened further in death. Her corpse swelled. The smell became unbearable. Physicians ordered the chamber sealed, fearing the rot would spread. Within hours, Elizabeth was proclaimed queen. The bells rang, not for grief, but for relief. Mary's body was carried to Westminster. In a procession as cold as the November fog, the people lined the streets, not in tears, but in curiosity, craning to see the coffin of the woman they had called Bloody Mary. And when the lid closed over her rotting flesh, so too did England close, the book on her reign, not with love, not even with hate, but with silence. The moment Mary's breath left her body, history began rewriting itself. Elizabeth Tudor, her half-sister and rival, stepped into the throne with a smile the court had not seen in years. To the people, it felt as if winter had broken and sunlight had poured into England. But behind the celebration was something colder, the deliberate burial of Mary's memory. Advisors who once knelt to her now spoke of her in whispers, as if she had been a shadow, not a queen. The fires she lit, she took, became weapons for Elizabeth's propaganda. Every burned body became another brick in the story of a tyrant. Bloody Mary. The name spread like plague. Elizabeth's first acts were not just to restore Protestantism, but to cleanse the throne of Mary's ghost. Her portraits were removed, her policies undone. Even in death, Mary was exiled, her body laid in Westminster Abbey, but denied the grandeur her father and predecessors received. And yet, erasure is never complete. The smell of rot lingered in the memory of every servant who had walked her deathbed corridors. The sight of her blackened flesh haunted the physicians who had tried in vain to save her in taverns and markets. The stories twisted. Some said her body had burst in the coffin. Others claimed her skin had turned completely black, proof of divine punishment. Superstition and politics merged until the woman became a monster. A warning, a curse. Elizabeth understood the power of that myth. To build her golden age, Mary had to be remembered as darkness. And so the first Queen of England was cast into history not as a ruler, but as a spectra, rotting body wrapped in the smoke of her own fires. But in the quiet corners of England, some still whispered prayers for her soul, not out of love, but out of fear, because they knew what power does to the dead, and they feared Mary Tudor was not done with her country yet. It did not take long for Mary's death to leave the realm of history and enter the realm of legend. In taverns, they whispered that her corpse had blackened so completely that even the priests feared to touch it. Some claimed the coffin leaked foul fluids onto the abbey floor, a sign that her soul was forever damned. Others swore the stench of rot lingered in Westminster for months, a curse on the throne itself. But the most chilling stories came from those who had been inside St. James's Palace. Servants told of cold winds moving through locked rooms, the sound of weeping near the Queen's sealed chamber, a smell of smoke where no fire burned, and then came the name, Bloody Mary. At first, it was a curse whispered in fear. Then it became something more. Parents used it to frighten children into obedience. Priests invoked it as a warning of sin, and over time, the name detached from the woman entirely, transforming into a specter in the mirror, a ghost summoned by candlelight. Elizabeth's court did not stop the stories. They encouraged them. Each tale of rot, each whispered curse, turned Mary into a cautionary tale and made Elizabeth's reign shine brighter. History was being written not with ink, but with smoke and shadow. There were other whispers, too, that Mary had been poisoned, her blackened flesh the mark of arsenic or mercury, that Philip himself had arranged it, ridding himself of a barren queen. No evidence survived, only rumors, fed by the grotesque state of her corpse. But perhaps the most haunting rumor was the simplest, that Mary's body had not decayed like flesh at all, but burned like wood, as if the fire she had lit in England had claimed her in the end. Fact and myth bled together until the Queen who had lived and died became something else entirely, not a woman, not even a monarch, but a ghost made of blood and smoke, forever trapped between prayer and curse. Centuries have passed since Mary Tudor's blackened body was lowered into the cold earth beneath Westminster Abbey. The fires she lit are long gone, the ashes of her victims scattered into history, and yet she is still here. Every time someone whispers Bloody Mary into a dark mirror, every time the story of her rotting death is told in a trembling voice, the Queen rises again, not as flesh, but as a warning. Was she a monster, or was she a woman, broken by a life of exile, humiliation, and fear, wielding the only weapon she believed she had? That is the horror at the heart of her story. Not just the flames, not just the rot, but the ease with which power turns pain into cruelty, and cruelty into legend. Elizabeth's golden age needed a villain, and Mary's corpse became the perfect one. History carved her into something less than human and more than myth. The woman disappeared, the ghost remained. But ghosts do not come from nowhere. They are born from silence, the silence of the crowd that watched the pyres burn, the silence of the courtiers who turned away from her deathbed, the silence of a nation eager to forget what it had done in the name of faith. Perhaps that is why her story lingers like the smell of smoke in an empty room, because beneath the rot and the fire lies a truth we are afraid to face. Mary Tudor was not the first to be devoured by power, and she will not be the last. When you speak her name, you are not just calling a ghost. You are calling a warning, a reminder that the line between salvation and damnation is as thin as a flame and just as easy to cross. Have you ever heard of a darker fate than this? Do you see Mary as a monster, or a victim of the age she was born into? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe.